Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode is called Battery Raw Materials, How Will They Reshape the Global Battery Supply Chain? And you're here with me, Rebecca Bell-Chambers, S&P Global Mobility Supply Chain and Technology Thermal Research Analyst. And I'm joined today by three members of the Batmen and Batwomen team, S&P Global Mobility Supply Chain and Technology's own superhero team of battery experts. Welcome to the podcast. We have Ali Adim covering the European domain, Han Gao covering Greater China region, and Jay Huang covering the North American battery market. Hello to you all, and thank you for joining me on this week's episode of Autology.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks.
Hi, Rebecca. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me here.
You're welcome. So to start off with, I wanted to ask you, Ali, if you could give us a brief introduction into the topic of battery raw material and its supply chain. Now, I know that the battery team have recently launched its battery raw material dataset. Could you give us a bit more information about that, please?
Yes, sure, Rebecca. So currently we are seeing a really strong demand for the electric vehicles. And on the longer term also, the car makers should comply with really aggressive environmental regulations. Speaking of Europe, no internal combustion engine can be sold after 2035. And in order to comply with all those environmental regulations, car makers are ramping up their EVs very quickly. In S&P Global Mobility, we are forecasting that by 2030, 38% of the total light-duty vehicle market would be full electric vehicle, and that's apart from mild hybrids and full hybrid types of vehicle. In order to make all those batteries that will go to the vehicles, you need to ramp up the battery production facilities very quickly. So we have estimated that by 2030, there would be a need for more than 3,500 gigawatt hour of the battery capacity only for the light duty vehicles. And as you can imagine, this huge ramp up will really strain the upstream material and mineral markets. We are in contact with our colleagues in S&P Commodity Insights, and they are predicting a shortage for a couple of battery raw materials, including nickel and lithium, starting from 2025. Here in our battery team in S&P Global Mobility, we are trying to understand better how OEMs and other players in this sector will act in a situation where the market is tight, not only for one material, but several raw materials. For example, we are seeing a clear trend towards vertical integration of OEMs or cell makers in the upstream supply chain levels. And that would be extremely crucial for these players in order to secure their supplies in a really tight market situation. We're also trying to understand how car makers or cell makers will tailor their technologies based on the availability of the raw materials. For instance, we know that nickel would be problematic. And as a car maker, you need to explore alternative technologies or chemistries in order to tackle and remedy this shortage. For example, we see clear trend towards LFP, although it has a lower energy density, but it will lift off some of the demand for the nickel and also cobalt. Some European suppliers also are exploring other territories like high manganese NCM solutions in order to tackle the nickel shortage. Or for example, for the lithium, we are seeing that European OEMs are more flexible in order to introduce smaller battery packs in order to reduce the lithium demand in their vehicles. So as a response to all this, we started the battery raw material project last year to answer all these questions. So this new offering of S&P Global Mobility that was launched actually this month is a model level forecast for the battery materials and raw materials all upstream to the cell manufacturing. So basically, when you look at a data set, you will be able to see the flow of the materials from the mining all the way to the cell manufacturing, including all the processing steps. And for the first phase of the project, we have included several materials in the cathode, like nickel, cobalt, manganese, and lithium, and 2 materials in anode, namely graphite and silicon. And in the second phase that will be published in a few months, we will add phosphorus, iron, and aluminum as well. And yeah, so we are really excited about this project, and we're trying to answer a lot of questions regarding the battery raw material supply chain within this new product.
Sure. So it sounds like there's a lot more exciting things to come, not to mention already what you guys have achieved. So that's great. Han, maybe you could give us some insight into the importance of China's role in the battery raw materials.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rebecca. And China now has a very well-established raw material processing supply chain to EV battery industry. This is majorly because to the accelerated demand for EV battery, especially in China in past few years. So on the one hand, the fast-growing domestic new electric vehicle market requires huge supply chain or huge supply of all the battery materials, which boost the local production capacity for the raw material. On the other hand, the raw material suppliers, like those big names like Huayou, Cobalt, GM, Rongbai, EA Spring, and CNGR, have been closely working with some other overseas battery suppliers and OEMs to deliver high quality cathode materials to better match their technical requirement for their global EV penetration. Well, the key battery materials is not just limited to the cathode, but also include the cathode precursor and battery grade lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese intermediates, and of course the anode materials and graphite processing steps. To be more specific, China is a major contributor of the artificial graphite along with South Korea and Japan. The supply chain in China involves not only the petrochemical giants like the Sinopec, but also some leading anode material suppliers like BTR, Shanshan, Hunan Xinzhu. Those players in anode material supply chain are signing partnerships through the supply chain and further expand their capacity to guarantee both the quality and the sustainable delivery of their product to global EV markets. On the other hand, like the cathode side, by 2028, China will have about like 65% of global cathode material production. This figure could be even higher considering a lot of recent investment in LFP cathode materials, which is a chemistry that widely adopted by Tesla's standard range for both Model 3 and Model Y, and of course for Chinese OEM BYD. This technology can help to reduce the demand for nickel and cobalt, which is in the shortage. The cathode precursor, which has significant impact on the cathode material performance, also mostly produced in China. We observe some Korea and Europe cathode material suppliers have signed JV or long-term supply deal with Chinese precursor suppliers. For example, the LG Chemical and POSCO both established joint venture with Huayou for the PCAM, and GM signed a long-term supply deal with EcoPro. Last, although some key metal mines are not located in China, the Chinese players have been actively sourcing mines and shipping the ores from Africa, South Asia, South America back to China for the battery grade material processing. Even for the leading lithium suppliers, Albemarle, they also locate over 1/3 of their lithium processing capacity and adding several new sites in China. For the manganese processing, over 90% of battery grade materials are produced in China and to supply the global demand.
Wow, so that really highlights the significance that China is having on the battery raw material market. So Jay, in North America, what would be the implications from the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act on the battery raw material supply chain?
Yep. Thanks for having me, Rebecca. And that's a great question. Before diving into the implications, I want to briefly explain about the IRA EV tax credit requirements for the listeners who may not be familiar with the concepts. So in the middle of August, Inflation Reduction Act 2022 was enacted, and the new scheme of $7,500 of EV tax credit will be effective from the beginning of 2023. And we can break it down into two parts. The one part is the $3,750 for battery components, which is half of the total $7,500 of EV credit. And another part is the battery critical minerals for another half. And I'll focus on half of the EV tax credit, which is battery critical minerals, to answer this particular question. And if you look at the battery critical minerals requirements, the IRA bill defined the percentage of the value of critical minerals used in battery, which should be extracted or processed in the US or in one of the free trade agreement countries, which is Canada, Mexico, Australia, Chile, South Korea, to name a few, or recycled in North America. And the percentage goes up from 40% in 2023 to 80% in 2029. And the critical minerals include lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and graphite, the usual suspects. And the foreign entity of concern is another important concept, which include China, Russia, Iran, North Korea should not be included in any of the extraction, processing, recycling process. And that's a brief summary of IRA on battery critical minerals. And to answer your question about the implications of IRA on North American battery raw material supply chain, we've done an in-depth analysis from our recently launched battery raw material product suite and summarized the aggregated percentage of three most important elements of the battery critical minerals, which are nickel, cobalt, lithium, and those values sourced from North America and FTA countries within all North American produced electric vehicles. And we expect more metal refining facilities in North America and FTA countries to be IRA eligible, which is the key findings from the data. And in 2023, less than 20% of total nickel, cobalt, lithium combined value miss IRA requirements on North America and FTA versus 40% in IRA requirements. And even in 2028, it's close to 60% versus 80% of requirements. And we expect that's the consequence of more new refining facilities than new mines, because the IRA criteria says extracted or processed, quote unquote, on one of eligible countries. And this means that it's fine if only metal refining happens in North America or FTA country. And there are actually many refining projects, especially in the US and Canada, as well as FTA countries that are being built by major lithium and nickel miners as of now. And you have to also remember the fact that critical mineral requirements are more lenient than component requirements, which I'm going to explain later. Since IRA bill says 80% of the IRA requirements for critical minerals domestic production versus 100% for components. And I guess this is due to the fact that, number one, the North American mining productions cannot cover all North American metal demand from electric vehicles, because we can build many factories as we want theoretically, but we cannot build natural resources reserves in North America. It's that simple. And number two, mining and refining take much longer than setting up battery component factories due to lots of stakeholders are involved. So as an example, greenfield mine should usually take at least 5 years to come online from planning, feasibility, environmental study, permission from the local governments, etc. And you have to take ESG and the local community into the consideration. And some says in the US, it takes more than 10 years to get the new mining permission alone. So it's a very difficult process than just setting up a factory. And regarding the foreign entity of concerns, we expect more metal refining facilities in alternative countries, or maybe some OEMs keep using China and giving us the EV tax credit. And I told you that less than 20% of North American FTA countries in 2023 from our analysis, but and you may question about the rest of 80%, and the rest of 80% can be broken down into 20% from foreign country and 60% from excluded entities, which is mostly China. And as my colleague Han mentioned, as of now, the battery metal refining facilities are heavily concentrated in China. And I would expect more refining facilities being moved to not only just the US and Canada, but also to FTA countries such as resourceful countries like Australia and Chile, and also to other resourceful foreign countries such as Indonesia. And on the other hand, some OEMs may rather choose to utilize their supply chain in China because it's the most efficient and very well established location so far, and choose economic benefits over EV tax credit benefits. But I would say the large amount of location diversification from the recently passed IRA will be inevitable.
Okay, great answer. Thank you for that. So I wanted to circle back around to Europe and ask you this, Ali. What are your biggest concerns in Europe regarding the battery raw material production?
Probably the most immediate concern would be related to the skyrocketing energy costs, especially after the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So last week I was in Germany, in Frankfurt, and I met some of the players, German companies, and most of them were really concerned about the electricity costs. And there were also some discussions about shutting down some of the facilities as basically it's not really worthwhile to run the company with all the high energy costs. Regarding the battery industry, both cell manufacturing and material processing are really energy intensive and constitute a really large portion of the cost structure of the business model. And we see already that the high prices have affected some of the cell maker and material producers. And in order to comply with the demand, we need to invest immediately, whereas these high prices will definitely impede some of the existing projects. On the longer term, on the other hand, bringing the material processing to Europe is quite challenging because Europe will be in competition with other regions to access the raw materials. As Han and Jay explained, China has already had start in establishing the battery supply chain with respect to other regions. And also North America has recently introduced a very generous incentive in order to localize and bring the investment into North America. On the other hand, Europe is not particularly rich in battery material resources. And even the existing projects are facing very challenging environmental permitting issues. We saw this issue with the Rio Tinto project in Serbia, for instance. And as a result, considering a Korean supplier, for example, it would be much more lucrative to invest in the US or North America than Europe, because over there you will benefit from tax credits, and then also you have to spend less for the energy costs. In Europe also, we have a lot of environmental regulations. European Commission has introduced a new regulation for the battery carbon footprint that will come into effect from 2027, that will force all the batteries in Europe to be below a certain carbon footprint. Otherwise, they cannot be sold in Europe. And that might lead the cell makers and the car makers in order to source their materials locally. Otherwise, if you want to ship it from other regions, you will not be able to comply with the carbon footprint regulation. So all in all, the message is that in Europe, compared to other regions, there are less incentives for the upstream material suppliers. There are incentives for the EVs, and for the customers, and little incentives for the upstream suppliers. And at the same time, these suppliers should comply with really stringent regulations and also the high energy costs on top of that.
Sure. Okay, so facing the challenges and the concerns for the battery raw material sourcing, what are the solutions from Chinese suppliers?
Yeah, I think there can be a lot of challenges. While one of the greatest challenge would be reducing carbon emission during the battery manufacturing. This is under the global transition to the carbon neutrality. For example, the anode material processing requires very high energy consumption for the steps called graphitization. So there are some Chinese anode suppliers are implementing so-called continuous graphitization facilities to replace the traditional ovens so that they can improve the energy efficiency as well as reducing the cost during the process. Moreover, some Chinese suppliers are planning capacity expansion in some provinces, such as Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou, which have more local renewable energy resources to lower the carbon footprint from the electricity supply side. One of the example would be that Chengdu B&M, which is one subsidiary of Huayou Cobalt, they made their successful shift to certified carbon neutral plant by having more local green energy supply from Sichuan province. And they also invest some money into upgrade their process and facilities so to better match the carbon neutral strategy. We will expect more suppliers are investing to having the same transition to carbon neutral plant in the future. And the other challenge is that as different country may have their specific raw material sourcing policy, so more and more Chinese suppliers are seeking for overseas processing capacity to better fit those requirements for the optimized logistics. This could definitely reshape the current concentrated raw material processing in China. Recently, we will see that there are several projects from Huayou, GM, CTL, and BTR in Indonesia to produce intermediates and anode materials. Some plants are already under operation to make the intermediates for the EV battery. Some chem suppliers like Rongbai and EA Spring, they are also planning to build Europe and the US cathode plants to better support the local mobility transition in respective regions. So that is what currently they are doing to encounter all the challenges from carbon, from the logistics. Back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Han. So going back to the question about the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm going to ask you a question about the battery component, which is another half of the EV tax credit. How well prepared is the US on establishing domestic battery component supply chain, and which part would you think is the weakest link within the battery components?
Yeah, I will be happy to cover another half of the IRA bill. So the IRA defined the percentage of the value of the battery components that should be manufactured or assembled in North America. And the percentage goes up from 50% in 2023 to 100% in 2029. And the battery components here include not only just the battery cells and modules, but also electrode active materials, which means cathode active material and anode active materials. I'll just call it cathode and anode for the sake of simplicity. And the aggregated value of components will be used for the calculation of percentage. And plug-in hybrids will be eligible because there's a minimum 7 kilowatt hour of battery capacities there. And foreign entity of concern requirements will be the same. So that's a brief summary of IRA requirements on battery components. And And the short answer to your question is cathode will be the most critical parts to be IRA eligible for the battery components. And if you look at the percentage of domestic production for each component, module and cell achieves more than 90% of domestic production, while cathode and anode achieve less than 50% and 5% respectively around 2030, according to our high voltage battery data before announcement of the IRA. And this is a snapshot of our team's forecast, which is updated on a monthly basis. So we expect cathode percentage will highly likely go up with the more cathode and OEM joint ventures after IRA. And I stress the importance of this cathode because cathode and cell components are the majority of the cost portion in battery cell pricing, while module components and anode are relatively less cost intensive. But in the long term, anode localization will be also very important because IRA requires 100% of localization by the end of 2028. So now, if you look at each component by component, cell module production in North America will remain high, thanks to lots of battery gigafactory announcements from both the US and foreign automakers. So with few exceptions, almost all US and foreign OEMs announced their plans for building battery cell gigafactory plants as of now, while cathode and anode productions will need more localization going forward. And some companies like GM POSCO Chemical, for example, set up a joint venture for cathode active material production. So the POSCO Chemical is a cathode supplier for GM battery suppliers, LG Energy Solution, and Ultium Cells. And another example is Tesla. Tesla will likely establish cathode facility by themselves in Texas, and EcoPro, a Korean cathode supplier for Ford's battery cell supplier SK On. But the overall commitment on cathode side has been relatively muted than battery cell announcements. And anode localization is also very important, like I mentioned, because the vehicle have to meet 100% localization. But it seems that there's only one meaningful anode company with capacity in Louisiana operated by a company called Sierra Resources. And anode manufacturing is mostly highly cost sensitive, not environmentally friendly per se. So most of them are based in China as of now, as Han outlined before. But the bottom line is that we're optimistic that battery electric vehicle mass adoption in North America in the long term, and we expect more localization use for the battery upstream and materials going forward. And our battery team, including Ali, Han, and myself, is working hard to help our clients achieving their transition to vehicle electrification by pinpointing the most critical bottlenecks within the battery supply chain with the market intelligence that we have. So our recently announced battery raw material product, which was the project led by Ali, was a very timely and appropriate example of those.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you everybody for joining me. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So I'd like to say a big thank you to the Batmen and Batwomen crew for joining the Autology podcast this week. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@spglobal.com email, and you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts, and we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.